In 1943, while most of the world struggled just to survive, the United States was doing something unprecedented in human history. It was fighting a global war across two oceans, supplying millions of men on distant continents, and still operating its cities, factories, and farms at full capacity. Lights burned through the night, trains ran without pause, assembly lines never slept. This was not merely a war effort, it was the construction of the most powerful logistical system the world had ever known. And the first people to truly grasp the scale of that achievement were not American citizens or Allied commanders. They were German prisoners of war, men who had been taught to believe that such a thing was impossible. For years, Nazi propaganda had portrayed the United States as a nation of excess and weakness, wealthy but undisciplined, technologically capable but socially fragile. America, they said, could build impressive machines, but lacked the discipline and endurance to fight a long, grinding war. It was a country that indulged too much, wasted too much, and would inevitably collapse once real sacrifices were required. Among German soldiers, especially those trained in logistics and engineering, this belief was taken almost as fact. No economy, they insisted, could supply a modern war on two fronts without breaking. No nation could move men, fuel, ammunition, food, and machines across the globe. Something would run out, something would fail, and when it did, America would fold. That confidence was still alive in May of 1943, when the German position in North Africa finally collapsed. The surrender in Tunisia was not just another defeat, it was one of the largest mass capitulations in modern military history. Between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms, many of them veterans of the Afrika Korps, men who had fought across deserts, pushed British forces to the brink of Egypt, and survived years of relentless combat. These were not inexperienced conscripts. They were seasoned professionals, mechanics, engineers, officers, logisticians, men who understood war not just as fighting, but as mathematics. As they stood behind barbed wire in the heat of North Africa, waiting to learn their fate, their morale was bruised but not broken. Many still believed the war itself was far from over. Germany, they told themselves, had lost a campaign, not the conflict. And when rumors spread that the Americans intended to transport them across the Atlantic to camps inside the United States, disbelief turned into laughter. America, they argued, did not have the ships. It did not have the food. It did not have the organizational capacity to manage hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers on its own soil while simultaneously fighting in Europe and the Pacific. The idea sounded like propaganda, a psychological trick meant to intimidate them. The first signs that something was wrong appeared almost immediately. At makeshift ports and processing camps in Algeria and Tunisia, the Americans began moving prisoners with an efficiency that unsettled even the most confident skeptics. Thousands were processed every day. Identity cards were issued. Medical examinations were conducted systematically. Vaccinations were administered without delay. Records were filed, sorted, and transported with a speed the Germans had rarely seen in their own army. Most disturbing of all was the calm professionalism of the American officers, many of whom spoke fluent German and explained Geneva Convention rights with practiced ease. This was not improvisation, it was preparation. Then came the food, not thin soup, not emergency rations, real meals, white bread, hot meat, coffee, consistent portions served day after day. The prisoners laughed again, convinced this was a performance, a temporary show meant to project strength. They assumed shortages would appear any day now, that the abundance would quickly disappear once the Americans realized the scale of what they had taken on. They did not yet understand that this was not generosity. This was routine. When the time came to move the prisoners, The scale of American logistics began to reveal itself in ways that could not be explained away. The ships waiting in the harbor were not sleek warships or symbolic flagships. They were cargo vessels, liberty ships, plain, functional, mass-produced vessels built not for beauty or prestige, but for speed and volume. These ships had been constructed in American shipyards in a matter of days, using prefabricated sections assembled like industrial puzzles. At peak production, several were launched every single day. The Germans, had they known the numbers, would have dismissed them as impossible lies. During the Atlantic crossing, the prisoners encountered something that deeply disturbed their understanding of scarcity. Food was wasted, not hidden, not rationed carefully, thrown away openly. Half-eaten meals discarded without ceremony. Bread left untouched, milk poured out, not to humiliate them, not to demonstrate power, but because replacements were readily available. One German soldier would later write that the American crew disposed of more food in a single day than his entire unit had received in a week during the final months of desert fighting. To the prisoners, this behavior was incomprehensible. No disciplined society, they believed, could survive such waste. Still, they clung to one final assumption. This excess, they told themselves, could not last. It was a temporary illusion, sustained only because America had not yet felt the full strain of war. Once losses mounted, once supply lines stretched too far, once production slowed, the truth would reveal itself. America would choke on its own inefficiency. That belief died the moment they reached the American coast. In August of 1943, as the ships approached Virginia, the prisoners stood on deck and stared in silence. Ports stretched for miles, alive with motion. Cranes lifted massive loads with ease. Ships arrived, unloaded, and departed in continuous cycles, day and night. In a single harbor, they witnessed more logistical activity than some German ports handled in a week. The scale alone was staggering. But what followed was worse. They were not loaded into boxcars, not herded into freight wagons. They boarded passenger trains, real trains, coaches with padded seats, dining cars with tablecloths, sleeping berths that converted smoothly from seats. One American guard apologized casually that the air conditioning in a car wasn't functioning properly. Air conditioning in August. The prisoners exchanged glances. For many of them, this technology was something they believed existed only for Hitler's personal train. As the trains rolled westward, mile after mile of American territory unfolded before them, and with it, the complete destruction of everything they thought they knew. Small towns glowed with electric light. Homes burned lights in multiple rooms. Shops stayed illuminated long after sunset. Factories operated through the night, their windows bright, their parking lots full, even at midnight. Rail yards functioned with mechanized loaders, electric pumps, and automated systems that replaced entire teams of men. Nothing slowed, nothing paused. Some of the prisoners began to calculate power consumption, production rates, transport capacity. They counted factories. They estimated output. And slowly, painfully, they reached the same conclusion. This was not excess. This was not waste. This was scale, deliberate, organized, and sustained. By the time the trains reached the American interior, the laughter was gone. As the trains pushed deeper into the American interior, what the German prisoners witnessed was no longer shocking in isolated moments. It became a pattern, an overwhelming, inescapable pattern of scale, speed, and coordination that defied every rule they believed governed modern warfare. The United States was not merely producing war material, it was producing it everywhere, all at once, in volumes that made comparison meaningless. For soldiers raised in a system obsessed with efficiency and discipline, the realization was deeply unsettling. This was not chaos disguised as abundance. This was abundance disciplined into power. In Tennessee, the trains passed massive industrial complexes stretching for miles along rivers that had been transformed into engines of production. Aluminum plants roared day and night, consuming more electricity than entire European cities. Prisoners trained as engineers recognized the furnaces immediately, understood what they required, and grasped the implication without anyone needing to explain it. Aluminum meant aircraft. Aircraft meant air superiority. And the numbers were terrifying. Facilities that dwarfed anything Germany had ever built were operating not as experimental projects or emergency measures, but as permanent, fully integrated components of a national system. To the Americans, this was normal. Further north, the landscape revealed another layer of the logistical machine. Synthetic rubber plants rose from what had been empty fields only months before. Entire industrial towns had been built almost overnight. The prisoners knew these processes well. Germany had pioneered synthetic rubber, but never managed to produce it in sufficient quantities. Here, in a single region, the Americans were producing several times Germany's peak output, and doing so with newer, more efficient methods. Chemists among the prisoners stared in silence, recognizing equipment designs more advanced than anything they had worked with back home. It was no longer possible to argue that this was waste or inefficiency. This was mastery. As the trains approached the Midwest, the heart of American industrial power revealed itself fully. Outside Detroit, the prisoners caught sight of a factory so vast it seemed unreal. Ford's Willow Run plant stretched across the horizon, its size visible from miles away. Inside, bombers were being assembled with a speed that bordered on the absurd. One aircraft rolled off the line every hour. Not prototypes, not experimental models. Fully operational heavy bombers built from more than 1 million parts supplied by thousands of subcontractors across the country. The prisoners pressed their faces against the windows, counting aircraft, watching assembly lines move with mechanical precision. Luftwaffe veterans, men who had been told American planes were inferior, poorly built, and rushed, felt something close to dread. These machines were not inferior. They were simply built faster than Germany could ever hope to match. At this point, many of the prisoners began to understand something that few soldiers ever fully grasp in the middle of a war. Battles decide days. Industry decides decades. If you're finding this story compelling, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. These are the real, often overlooked moments that reveal how wars are truly won, not just with weapons, but with systems, planning, and national resolve. The deeper they traveled, the more complete the psychological collapse became. What disturbed the prisoners most was not the factories themselves, but the fact that they seemed endless. There was no single center of production to destroy, no bottleneck to exploit. Power plants, rail hubs, factories, ports, and supply depots were distributed across an entire continent. Even if one was damaged, dozens more continued operating without pause. The German strategy of concentrated industrial hubs, vulnerable to bombing and disruption, suddenly felt fragile by comparison. America was too large, too decentralized, too resilient. Equally unsettling was the wealth of ordinary American workers. At train stops, the prisoners watched railway employees perform complex operations in minutes using automated systems and electric machinery. These were not elite engineers or party officials. They were civilians, laborers, men who arrived at work in their own cars, wore sturdy boots that would have cost a German worker months of wages, drank bottled soft drinks, and discarded half-finished cigarettes without a second thought. The casualness of it all was perhaps the most damaging blow. This level of material comfort was not reserved for the powerful. It was routine. Electricity, in particular, haunted the prisoners. Lights burned in empty buildings. Fans ran in unoccupied rooms. Entire towns glowed through the night without blackout restrictions. In Germany, darkness had been a constant since the early years of the war, a reminder of vulnerability and scarcity. Here, light was everywhere. One former electrical engineer among the prisoners calculated that a single rail yard they passed consumed more electricity in an hour than his entire Berlin district used in a day. He later described it as the carelessness of infinite resources. Not reckless, confident. Somewhere between the Mississippi River and the plains beyond, the final illusion collapsed. A senior officer, trained in logistics and engineering, began calculating not just what he was seeing, but what it meant over time. Production rates multiplied by months. Supply capacity scaled across continents. Energy generation sustained without interruption. He realized that even if Germany won every battle from that point forward, it would still lose the war. The numbers did not lie. This was not a contest of courage or tactical brilliance anymore. It was a contest of systems, and Germany was trapped in a system that could not grow fast enough. The laughter that had once echoed in the camps of North Africa was gone. Conversations among the prisoners grew quiet, then grim. Some spoke openly for the first time about the inevitability of defeat. Others withdrew, struggling to reconcile what they had seen with everything they had believed. Nazi propaganda had promised that American excess would be its undoing. Instead, excess had been refined into efficiency. Comfort had been transformed into endurance. Abundance had become the foundation of an unstoppable war machine. By the time the trains reached their final destinations in Texas, Oklahoma, and beyond, the transformation was complete. The prisoners stepped off not as mocking skeptics, but as witnesses. They had seen the mathematics of defeat written across a continent. They understood now that the war's outcome had been decided not by a single battle or campaign, but by factories that never slept, railways that never rested, and a logistical system that treated distance as an inconvenience rather than a barrier. Years later, many of these men would write about that journey as the moment they knew the war was lost. Not when they surrendered, not when cities were bombed, but when they realized that the United States had turned industry itself into a weapon more powerful than any tank or aircraft, a weapon built not on fear, but on coordination, innovation, and an unmatched ability to mobilize an entire society toward a single goal. They had laughed at American logistics. They believed abundance meant weakness, that comfort meant fragility. What they encountered instead was the greatest demonstration of industrial and organizational power the modern world had ever seen. A nation capable of feeding, transporting, equipping, and sustaining millions of men across oceans and continents without breaking stride. If you want more true stories like this, stories that reveal how the United States reshaped modern warfare, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because history isn't just about what happened on the battlefield, it's about the forces behind it. And few forces have ever been as decisive as American logistics.